OCO, and welcome to the Cherokee Phoenix Breakdown. I am Tyler Thomas, the Executive Editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, and I am joined today by Dr. Hugh Foley, Professor of Cinema and Native American Studies at Rogers State University, and Kim Teehee, Cherokee Nation Delegate to the United States Congress and Vice President of Government Relations for Cherokee Nation Businesses. In this virtual roundtable discussion, we will hear the thoughts of Dr. Foley and Delegate Teehee in respect to the use of Native American nicknames and imagery in high school, collegiate, and professional athletics, and the possible effects of the use of names and imagery over time. Dr. Foley and Delegate Teehee, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with both of you, especially Delegate Teehee and you too, Tyler.
Thank you. All right, so the topic of Native American nicknames and mascots in sports was brought to the forefront once again this summer when pressure from corporate partners and the public forced Washington NFL franchise owner Dan Snyder to do away with the more than 80-year-old nickname of his football team. Dr. Foley, can you give me a brief history of the use of Native American nicknames and imagery in sports?
Sure, I do the best I can here. With regard to Native American imagery in athletics, we really have to go back to the beginnings of Native people in popular culture, and that starts with the Europeans arriving and starting to send imagery back to Europe. And then it gets into what most scholarly approaches look at as the noble savage. And it's that image that you can really take forward from the 1600s to present day athletics. So we really start with that. And then we get into all of the other ways in which those particular images impact people. And my particular focus in the educational environment is young people, especially children, because the basic thesis with this goes that Native American mascots stereotype all Native people as one monolithic race without any distinction whatsoever. The mascots make light of significant cultural traditions. They encourage, and this is probably the worst part, anti-Indian imagery. So one team plays another team, they create some negative imagery that often is violent toward Native people. And then finally it gets into the whole concept of negative epithets for Native people, whether it's the R word from the Washington Pro football team that is now on the way out, or terms like savages and things like that. Let's remember that the American Indian Movement, National Congress of American Indians, called for the elimination of these mascots starting back in the 1960s. And it's taken us almost 60 years to get to this point where we're starting to discuss the elimination of most of them, although there's a lot of problematic issues. One thing I would really emphasize is Stephanie Freiberg and her research and the impact that these images have on Native American youth. And I think that that's really the crux of the whole issue.
Delegate Teehee, what do you believe has been the appeal of Native American mascots and imagery and its utilization in sports?
Fortunately, I think there is an enormous educational gap about who we are as Native Americans, our history and our culture. And most people to this day still get their education or their information about us from television, movies, and cartoons. And especially the generation of my parents and my generation. Now, some of that is changing, thankfully, because we have Native filmmakers today and such who are telling a different story and are depicting us in a way that, we want to be portrayed. That's also adding to the education piece. So I believe that when the narratives that non-natives have about Indians is created by these other mediums, television, movies, etc., that they believe when they think of chiefs, braves, warriors, that they're not thinking of how we perceive a chief, a brave, or a warrior. They're thinking of this fictional stereotype, this imagery of an individual's exaggerated features. And maybe that's the appeal. I don't know. But I don't think they're necessarily thinking about the historical mistreatment of Native Americans in this country or the psychological effect that Dr. Foley just talked about on our youth especially. I grew up a sports fan, watching my brother play every sport imaginable, but I grew up in two towns where one mascot was the Bulldogs and the other was zebras. I didn't encounter myself a school that had a mascot until I went to NSU. And, thankfully NSU changed their mascot name from Redmond to the Riverhawks. And, but, going back to what you said earlier too, is, even before the NCAI and before I was born, there were these efforts to try to change, the narrative and to try to, create this education about the negative effects that a mascot has on an individual. And so, OU changed the little red mascot that they had, right, in 1970. And so I think it's a good thing when they start changing the names. My hope is that, Oklahoma still has a number of schools that have various mascots, the R word included. And so my hope is, I live in Tulsa, so my hope is that Tulsa Union Public Schools changes their names soon. But it's not a perfect world. If it were, then we wouldn't have Native American imagery in professional sports at all.
Good points. Dr. Foley, in your studies and research, what are the effects that you have found of the use of Native American mascots and imagery in sports?
Well, the first place that we have to go is Stephanie Freiberg, Dr. Stephanie Freiberg. She really is the leader in the research in all of this. And so, there are a lot of people who worked on this over the years, whether it's Suzanne Schoen-Harjo, Dr. Cornell Peeweewardy, Jay Rosenstein, Charlene Teeters. I mean, there's a whole list of people that have been working on this for a while, but Dr. Freiberg's recent research is what's most interesting, and I have to look at it here. What's really interesting is that self-esteem is raised for non-natives when there's a native mascot, whereas self-esteem is lowered for natives when there is a native mascot. In addition to that, there's a direct correlation between the connection to one's authentic understanding of their tribal roots and their feelings about the mascot. And what we tend to see is people who are more distanced from their native roots tend to like mascots more, because at least it's an acknowledgement of native existence that they can celebrate and adhere to themselves without actually having a tribal background. But those people who are closer to their tribal background don't like the mascots so much. So I think all that's really important. Also, in addition to that, negative stereotypes are associated with student disengagement. And so we have seen decreased aspirations for leadership and careers with students that come out of these environments where Native people are depicted in a certain way, whereas they're not depicted positively. And we always say, why can't we have an astronaut as a representation of a Native American? Why does it have to be some frozen, ossified image from the 19th century? So when we look at assessment, which is big in education, impaired performance, and these are numbers that are hard to refute. When you look at the numbers associated with assessment or testing of Native students in those environments, it decreases the success of those students. It also, what I found really interesting from Dr. Freiberg, it decreases interpersonal relations between Native students who are in a school with a Native mascot and non-Native students with a Native mascot. So these things are all important. Never mind, teaching stereotyping is acceptable at a young age, which then keeps on going. And in the present day, I was just, reading the paper this morning, we're in a really unique time of social change. And if someone like Tulsa Union, in their mission, says they're trying to prepare students for a changing global society. Our society is changing on many different levels. And if an institution and a school district like Tulsa Union is truly preparing their students for a changing global society, they should use this as a perfect example or paradigm, as we say in the educational environment, for teaching how society evolves and educational institutions should evolve along with society and help prepare students for the changes in those societies. So along with all the negative effects, there potentially are some positives for those educational environments that actually change these things. On the commercial level, it's trickier, and that's kind of a whole different discussion. But what I'm focusing on now is the way in which these mascots impact Native American youth in a negative way.
Delegate Teehee, the Cherokee Phoenix recently conducted a survey on the issue. Of the 290 survey participants who identified as a citizen of a federally recognized tribe, 61% said that the R word as a nickname was offensive. 73% said the nickname Savages was also offensive. However, 52% said the nickname Indians was not offensive. 54% said Chiefs or Chieftains was not offensive. 58% said Braves was not offensive, and 67% said Warriors was not offensive. Delegate T, what do you say to those citizens of tribes who say they're not offended but feel the use of some Native American nicknames and imagery honors Native people?
Well, Tyler, thank you, first of all, for conducting a survey. And it's always good to check the pulse of your readership. But I do think they are in the minority. I think there are national studies and national research that has been conducted. Dr. Foley just talked about them, but these citizens are entitled to their opinion. But research shows us that it's wrong. And when teams and fans yell, "Scalp the Indians, send them back to the Trail of Tears," that has an impact on our psyche. And you can't deny that. And the way in which it happens, I remember being a law student at the University of Iowa and being stunned whenever we were playing Illini, the Greek system hanging Indians as just part of the, with no thought about what that did to the Indian students who were watching them hang Indians. And so luckily, I was able to bring the late Frank Lemire to campus, and he worked with me and others, students and the administration, to try to address our concerns to ensure that that kind of thing would not happen again. But it does something to your psyche. It tells you you're not valued as a Native, as a young person and such. And so, Chief Hoskin has said, if you want to honor us who we are today, as thriving sovereign governments, and work with us, because these other things are not quite doing it.
Also in the survey, we asked participants if they believed that there was a difference between predominantly non-Native schools or professional teams using Native nicknames and imagery than predominantly Native schools, such as Sequoia High School, Riverside Indian School, and even Haskell Indian Nations University. 54% said they did not believe there was a difference. Delegate Teehee, do you agree, or do you think predominantly Native schools should have the ability to use Native mascots if they so choose?
I think as a fundamental matter, we have a right to celebrate who we are as Native people. Sequoia is a school that began as an orphanage. I don't know if you see behind me, but I collect Cherokee baskets, Cherokee patterns, Sequoia pottery from the orphanage, because that's part of who I am culturally. My parents and my aunt are all Cherokee first language speakers who went to Sequoia. And I remember having a conversation with my mother as I started learning more about the boarding school experience, because my mom and my aunt loved Sequoia, they still do, and asked about, the challenges in using your language in school and being discouraged from doing that. And my mom was quick to say, there are students from so many other tribal nations that you didn't talk Cherokee because nobody else could understand you unless you were speaking to somebody else. So you spoke English to everybody. So that didn't have the impact it had. My point in saying this is our own Sequoia High School are the Sequoia Indians. And we have a different way when we are connected to our culture and our history of honoring. We honor our elders, we honor our leaders, we honor our veterans, our ceremonies, our spiritual leaders, our ways of life. We don't have a mascot. We don't have chants, so we have a way of and a deep connection to what it is. And the Indian label is a reflection of the fact that that school has several students and faculty who are from different tribes. The challenge, it's not without a challenge. The challenge is when the opposing team and the fan base play our school, and the imagery and the chants and the slurs you hear as a result. That's the thing that, breaks my heart, that our young people who have such pride in going to a school like Sequoia have to endure to this day. So I do think that, that there is a place for schools that serve predominantly Native Americans, such as Sequoia, to have the right to use that term, because we uniquely are Native American and we have a way of a deeper understanding of what that means to us.
Yeah. Some tribes, such as the Seminole Nation of Florida and the Ute Indian tribe, have either passed a resolution or signed an MOU supporting respective schools, Florida State and the University of Utah, to use their tribes as nicknames or mascots. How can institutions like Florida State, University of Utah, and others utilize this opportunity to take meaningful action to accurately portray the Native people and share their cultures to large audiences across the nation? That's to you, Delegate Teehee. I'm sorry.
I think similarly to the last question, I do think that it is certainly on the right path whenever a team engages tribes and, in conversation with MOUs, with understandings and such. I do think that that's a better thing. But again, it's going to be very difficult to try to control the opposing team and the fan base. I mean, that is just as damaging. So, I don't know what the scale is, something that's extremely offensive or something that's kind of offensive because, the school may be doing right by incorporating tribal views and such in education material, but once the fan base and opposing teams come on board, I mean, there's still the aspect of racism and still the negative impacts that come with the use of those mascots. So, I mean, I think that it's a positive step to have those kind of relationships and to have those conversations and dialogue with neighboring schools and to have, this issue addressed at the local level, but you're always going to have those challenges.
That's a good point, because when Florida State played OSU, I think it was 2014, and they had OSU students creating the banners that said "Send them back on the Trail of Tears" or something to that effect. Even in the state of Oklahoma, where you'd think there would be more education and knowledge of what kind of message that sends, you still had those challenges.
Well, one of the things I would emphasize is that when the NCAA came down with its decisions that changed the Northeastern State University Redmen to Redhawks, they put in there a requirement that any institution that used a namesake tribe had to have approval from that tribe. The Utes, the Seminoles, of Florida State, got that approval, even though the Oklahoma Seminoles did not agree with it. Still, they went with Florida. The Chippewas in Michigan also approved that, but there could be no agreement among the bands of the Sioux regarding the Fighting Sioux of North Dakota. So that one wasn't approved. So, there was a mechanism in place to try and fix all of that with regard to just generic names at the NCAA level. But we don't have that kind of situation at the public school level. One thing I might say on the professional level is while a lot of teams are thinking about it, and we have the Washington situation, the Chicago Blackhawks do work with the Sac and Fox. And the Sac and Fox have a representative that interacts with them because obviously Blackhawk is a historic chief of the Sauk people. And people are on different sides of that, whether or not that should even go. But the fact is, at least the Blackhawks are working with the Sac and Fox to try and do something positive. So that's really all I wanted to jump in on that part, was that there were some agreements between the NCAA and some of the schools, but there was a lot of objection, even in Tahlequah, about Northeastern and the Redmen. And now some people just can't let it go. So now there's a kind of a Redmen heritage wall there around the campus, so that on game days, if we ever get to have game days again, alumni can come and circle around that Redmen experience, even though it's gone. It's part of history. And these things are just, to me, examples of what one of my mentors, Dr. Pete Koester, used to always talk about, which was not just systemic racism, which is kind of a buzzword now, but institutionalized racism. So racism that is built into the system. So something like Tulsa Union, I think they started in 1919.
Well, we know that American Indians were not even citizens in 1919. And a lot of these mascots come from around the statehood era of 1907 and forward, when Native people were not even citizens of the United States. And that was not that far removed from the Indian Wars to start with, you know? And so the Plains Indian has borne the brunt of a lot of these negative images throughout the last century. So I know it was a little bit of a ramble, but I just wanted to make sure I got in that part about namesake schools having to work with their area tribes. And in a few cases it's worked, and in some cases it hasn't.
Yeah. Dr. Foley, obviously here in Oklahoma, people know natives, or most people know natives, and most likely have had some exposure to native cultures with 38 federally recognized tribal governments in our state. But what about those states where people aren't as exposed to authentic native cultures and people?
Well, you know, I'm sorry, do you want to finish that?
No,
jump
please.
on it? Okay. Well, what I would say nationwide, people hopefully will start to think about is how at the educational level now, I'm not talking about the pop culture pro sports level, but at the educational level, we have the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which outlaws discrimination. The Equal Education Opportunities Act of 73, 74 also states all kinds of important legislative information, legal information about unlawful practices, and no state denying equal educational opportunities to individuals on account of their race, color, national origin, anything like that. And now we're moving forward into just even Title IX, which has been used for women's sports, but now is being more used for bullying. That, you know, you can't have an equal educational environment if you have a representation of a Native person that is inaccurate and frozen in time from the past. So where I'm really coming from now is the educational level. And what I think about are little kids. I keep saying this over and over again. People are in their 40s and 50s and 60s. Okay, whatever, you know, you think what you think. But what we're trying to do is take positive steps for little kids. And what I try and also get at is just the concept of a compromise. If you're involved with the school system and you're playing, like Delegate Teehee said, another team with an Indian mascot, can you not make fun of them? Can you not create anti-Indian imagery? I've got a whole collection of things people have given me that are just reprehensible images of Native people when they were playing, when that team was playing somebody else. So a good example is Catoosa right here in Oklahoma. The giant Hard Rock complex there that has totally changed the way that Catoosa looks. Not just the facility itself, but right across the street, all the new stores and restaurants and hotels that have come in. It's really expanded that area. But if you look just right behind that shopping complex, there's Catoosa High School. And not to pick on Catoosa High School, but they're the Indians, right? And so they have nothing that even remotely relates to Cherokee. It's the classic frozen in time noble savage that I mentioned at the very beginning, that's on all of their signage and everywhere. And yet right across the street, you have this totally modern representation of commerce, of Native American life. And so there's a dichotomy there that is off, you know. It's like, so what are we really trying to teach people with all of that? So I just would get back to the compromise part, because, you know, we have to teach students how to negotiate and how to deal with multi-sided issues. And this, for the longest time, I've used this as a multi-sided argument. There's Native people who really care about this. There's Native people who really don't care about it. They're sick of hearing about it. There's non-Natives who are really passionate about trying to help people get it changed. There's non-Natives who don't care and just think it's a political correctness issue. And so you have all these different dynamics. Well, how do you negotiate that? Well, that's an important step in critical thinking, is learning to distance oneself emotionally from a situation, if we can, and look at all these different sides. And so that's what I try and tell people when I go out and talk is, can you get your school to stop doing the tomahawk chop of all things? You know, can you stop dressing up kids in fake regalia? How about Tulsa Union that runs all their players out of a smoking teepee? Well, but they're talking about changing. But just all these images that are associated with the stereotypes of Native American history, can we move beyond them? And I think that that's where we're really trying to get to now is to teach people that these images are negative and these activities are negative, and they impact especially children in a negative way. So I know that was kind of a ramble, but just all the things that are going across my mind there.
Yeah. Delegate Teehee, do you have any thoughts?
Well, Tyler, I spent my career educating. When I worked in DC for so long, before I could get to why tribes needed federal resources for whatever priorities they had, whether it was school, infrastructure, healthcare, et cetera, it always had to begin with, why are we even legislating in this area in the first place? There is an enormous educational gap that exists, even in the neighboring schools within the Cherokee Nation. I mean, and we've had some major decisions come down that benefited the tribes recently. And there's a lot of confusion about it because as a fundamental matter, most people don't learn about tribes, treaty rights, much less a lot of the bad things that happen, like the infamous Trail of Tears, for example. I mean, people say these things, but they don't really know what it means. And so I do think that the education piece of it probably is more important than the compromise piece of it. It's an appreciation for history of the people that are being depicted in the stereotypical way that we need to address.
Dr. Foley, the use of Native American mascots has been in play since the early 20th century, and the movement to stop the use of Native mascots began as early as the 1940s by the National Congress of American Indians. There have been some small changes along the way, including some universities ending their use of Native nicknames or imagery over time, including Oklahoma and Stanford and Dartmouth, to some professional teams removing the Native imagery previously used from their uniforms and merchandise, such as the Cleveland Indians, to now the Washington NFL franchise ending their use of the R word as their nickname. After all these years, why are we now seeing significant action on this issue?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's just a way in which society is moving forward, especially after this summer. And all of the social justice activities that have been taking place. And not only that, but we have a pandemic going on where everybody has a lot of time to read and look at their phones and follow the news of what's happening. And, it's unfortunate that it takes these tragic events to get people to realize the disparities between people in the United States. And so, that's really the crux of this whole thing, is that society is starting to change. And as I mentioned earlier, we have to prepare our students to change along with it. And that's the nature of any good story. Has conflict, has opposing sides. But a story's not over until one of the other sides changes their opinion and has a revelation that, oh yeah, I get it now. I'll just say this quickly. I had a student at RSU who, for a capstone project, made up some fake mascots. And I'm not going to take the time to dig around and show them to you or anything, but, they came up with some other racial stereotypes and asked, how long would these things last if they were real? And so they had an African American one, and they had an Arab American one, they had an Asian American one. And each one of those were types that we had in the past that in one context could be thought of as brave and honoring that particular culture and all of that. But how long would, they had one for a Christian school that had, and not to be offensive to anyone here, but they had a picture of Jesus on the side of a helmet, and he's doing a Heisman pose, and he's got like a red print here for where he's pierced, and he's got another piercing here. And if that were on the side of a football helmet and the team was just called the Christians, how long would that last in Oklahoma? About 0. So what we're really trying to do is get to a point where we understand that, and this is just from my point of view of working around all this for so long, and my family and all the things that involve me in this situation, I'll just say quickly that, about 22 years ago, I started hauling a little video camera around Oklahoma and looking at high school football games. I didn't have a grant, nothing. I was just like, let me go see what's up. And I got some of the worst images that you can imagine. For a researcher, it was like, great, I got this and this and this. But as a person, as a human, I was like, I can't believe this stuff's going on. And that was 1998. And here we are 22 years later, and Tulsa Union is the only one that's even talking about it. So I think it's just a general change in society brought on by the events of this summer, and people being more sensitive to the fact that these things, need to change. I'm gonna put this, I just happen to have this here. Here's a film, from probably 60 years ago, Abbott and Costello. No Indians, please. How about, and with respect to Delegate Teehee, who I know is a Claremore High School graduate, also RSU as well. So, but here's from Claremore, Oklahoma. Look, mom, no hair, pretending to be scout. This is from the 1950s.
Wow.
So we don't, these things, you look at that and you're like, God, that's ridiculous. Why would that even exist?
Right.
And the same thing's going to happen 50 years from now when people look back at this time. And if we can change Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben and Eskimo pies and all of this kind of thing, even though Eskimo Joe's, where I live in Stillwater, they decided not to change. So there are some people who buy in and some people who don't buy in. But if you're an observer of all of this, this has all come about as a result of what's happened this summer. And people are just starting to have to really think about it more intensely and closely.
Yeah. Delegate Teehee?
If I could just add to Dr. Foley's statements, I would also add that, some other things have occurred since the Mascot issue really, started getting its legs since before I was born, and which is, today we have social media, right? We have social media. There's so many platforms to get the message out. If it weren't for, I think, people like Ray Halbritter, who funded the Change the Mascot effort and put real serious resources behind it, that campaign that was ongoing and sustainable, for such a long time, it didn't get legs until, and we always knew it wouldn't until corporate sponsors, started,
Right.
cutting legs of Dan Snyder's organization, and really until FedEx, Nike, other business partners of that organization started taking hold. And I think the opportunity presented itself because of the recent events in the Black Lives Movement and the George Floyd murder. But I also think that there has been such tremendous value that we were ready for this change to occur because of the work and the foundation that had been laid by so many others that Dr. Foley named earlier, whose efforts took place. And we had the materials in place. We had we kind of knew what to do next step. We just needed that opportunity. The biggest thing we needed at the table with us was the corporate sponsorship piece of it. And that's really what got the ball rolling, I think, at this time.
I think that's right. And capitalism is part of our country. And so definitely at the professional level, that is completely true. And I think that's, how do we trickle that down to the education level? And, I know we don't have a whole lot of time here, but what I would tack on is that the former principal chief of Cherokee Nation, Chad Smith, used to say, this is like, duh, we got a lot of other stuff we need to work on. Personally, for me, like what I try and emphasize now when we're talking about our native sugar, let's talk about sugar and diabetes and like the ravages that is having in Indian country and has since the 19th century. That is super duper serious. I mean, we're talking life and death, and nobody who's ever been around a diabetic in a hospital who's going down will ever look at it the same way again. Okay, so I just say that because think about Delegate Teehee. We should be talking to our kids about Delegate Teehee, the history that got her to where she is now. And students aren't really, learning those kinds of things. I go out and I'll say, okay, how many of you can tell me a team with an Indian mascot? Everybody raise their hand. And then I say, okay, now how many of you can tell me who Standing Bear is? Even what tribe he's from, anything. And people can't. And these are people who've grown up in the public school system in Oklahoma. And if you don't know who Standing Bear is, you're missing a lot of historical information. And if you don't, and even Delegate T, perhaps you don't know her name, but if you don't understand how it got to the point where she can be where she is, then you're also missing a lot of really big, important history. So here we are, still talking about, can we just get rid of these ridiculous stereotype images of Native people instead of talking about real significant historical issues that are circling back around? And what's happening now, if we can just go to a broader context, is history is biting the state of Oklahoma in the butt, if you want to go ahead and say it that way. That's what the McGirt decision is, and these other things that are coming down. And I don't want to, go political, but at the same time, it's important to think that this mascot issue should just be a no-brainer. And let's move to these other really significant topics that are still impacting Indian country from 150 years ago.
Good point. Delegate Teehee, Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. was very outspoken on the issue in the days leading to Washington doing away with the T nickname. Has the tribe had any dialogue with the local secondary schools within its reservation or at large on possibly changing Native nicknames that are currently being used?
Yeah, so, Chief Hoskin is the president of the Intertribal Council of the 5 tribes, and that includes the Cherokee Nation, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole Nations as well. And so they collectively have, passed resolutions condemning mascots for years and in the more recent dialogue. And so we circulate those. We also, have been working with the National Congress of American Indians and keeping track of the schools that have mascots, the efforts that they've undertaken, if any, to try to change their name or to educate people about Native Americans. And so we've had kind of, those dialogues. We've had also, I think the one that has come up the most is actually not even Oklahoma. It's in Texas. It's the Port Neches Groves school system. They have school systems. They are the Indians. And in 1979, the former chief of the Cherokee Nation, Ross Swimmer, signed a certificate and naming the school ambassadors of goodwill. And so that school has used since 1979 the endorsement of the Cherokee Nation to perpetuate the mascot premised on stereotypes, from headdress, totem poles, to they have called Indianettes who circle around the reservation, which is the actual football field. And they have the school song is called Cherokee, and the lyrics include scalp 'em, scalp 'em, scalp 'em. And so Chief Hoskin spoke to, I think, the deputy superintendent of the school system. He gave them a heads up, but he withdrew Cherokee Nation support and encouraged them to not use those kinds of stereotypes in imagery that they've been using for years. And there's great resistance in that community because they believe it's their tradition, even though they're not using anything remotely Cherokee, right? And they're using the headdress and the stereotypical images of an Indian and parading around in these, they don't even look like regular headdresses that you would see at actual powwows and such, but it's very damaging. And so they're holding on to that school system to what they consider to be their traditions. And so we're urging them to, not hold on to that because of the impacts that we've been talking about in this discussion that those imageries have on Native Americans, and asking them to change the name and it's and such. And so Chief Hoskin has been very engaged in that particular process in trying to change schools like that. But it's hard when you have resistance and schools just don't want to do it. And I also want to say, in looking at the website of that particular school, it's disheartening because it's an entire school district. It's not just the high school. It starts with grade school. Every class is pictured with a paper headdress that they probably cut out themselves. So they start very early learning how to how to view Indians and how that school, I guess, according to the school's narrative of what Indians are.
Delegate Teehee, there is a significant cost for any school that wants to change a nickname or imagery. In 2015, Capitol Hill and Oklahoma City changed their name from the R word to the Red Wolves. That change was expected to cost the district about $230,000. Has the tribe considered offering any financial assistance to school districts inside their reservation as an incentive to help schools make a change?
Not to my knowledge, but there are some tribes throughout the country that have put resources for that effort. I know the Oneida tribe of New York has done something similar to that. And to my knowledge, that's not been a fiscal issue that's been brought to us. But if we start talking about funding, I think that we should also start talking about the role that the Department of Education plays in this process, the role Congress plays in this discussion as well, and the perhaps the ability to maybe limit funding or to provide grants for schools that do decide to change the mascots. I mean, I do think that there's a place for funding so that the burden is not just on the tribe to get a school to do that. I do think that there should be a more national narrative that looks solely at the federal government and their responsibility to ensure that these mascots are eliminated from our school systems.
Remembering that.
Go ahead, Dr. Foley.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I saw your next question. I was going to jump in there. Remembering these are potentially unlawful practices at the federal level, and Delegate Teehee would, be able to speak to those after looking at the whole thing, and I'm sure she's thought about it already. But these are unlawful practices, the way I understand it, as an academic and a lay person just looking at the whole situation. So yes, I think that there could be some financial incentives from all kinds of avenues to potentially change these things. But let's remember that in the public school environment, these are tax-supported, institutionalized racism images. So it's already been funded for 100 years by the local property taxes. And so every time a new scoreboard goes up, every time a new sign goes up on a stadium, every time a new basketball floor is made, every time jerseys, every time stationery is made, whatever it is, that's all supported by tax dollars already. So you already have 100+ years of local financial tax-based support for these racist images. And so if we've had 100 years of support for them at the local tax-based level, it seems like as people start to change, that same local tax base could also be involved in changing those images. I understand we're under economic duress. I understand that no school system has enough money to put $5, $10, $15, $20,000 into changing their uniforms or whatever it is. But I think it's important that people remember that these public school mascots anyway are essentially tax-supported racism, which, as I mentioned before, Dr. Coaster used to always say is the classic example of institutionalized racism. What we're now hearing is systemic racism. Same thing, though. And the other thing I would add is, Dr. Peeweewardy, if I may, a lot of this is for Native people decolonizing themselves, in a lot of ways, getting past the idea that these are positive representations of Native people that honor them. And for me, I'm particularly honored just to even be here and be talking, because what we've seen over the last whole bunch of years is very powerful, educated, well put together Native people who are taking this issue on. So it's not non-Native, well-meaning educators saying you guys should change this, but it's Native people in leadership roles who are saying you should change this. Because I think as a society as a whole, the society wants to see Native people talking about this stuff, not a well-intentioned, however well-intentioned educator bringing forth the information. A lot of times I've been able to get into crowds I may not have been able to get into as a Native person, and been able to maybe affect some change. And not only that, I've been able to sneak around as a non-Native person and get some video and imagery that I would not have gotten if it was obvious what I was doing. So I think what's really powerful now is Delegate Teehee and the others I've mentioned previously are leading this particular philosophical, educational, and really health. We're talking about mental wellness of children here. And if people want to argue about that, what do you say? You know, I don't know.
So Tyler, I think the only thing I would add to Dr. Foley's comments is just, you know, it kind of goes back to also the why now question you asked earlier, which is tribes themselves are in a stronger economic position than they were, you know, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And as a result, have invested greatly in their surrounding communities too, because it's part of our homeland too. And also, you know, participating in the political process as well, and forging great relationships with members of Congress, and where we now have 4 members of Congress who are citizens of federally recognized tribes. And we have, you know, for the first time, you know, fairly recently, you know, about 50 members of Congress on a bipartisan basis, you know, penned a letter urging the changing of the Washington team's name. And so I do think there's great momentum. I think obviously tribes are used to having to juggle multiple priorities, and this is one of them. We've got to seize the moment because it's an opportunity that's presented itself, you know, and it starts with a major NFL team, but it should trickle down to the others, because I think this is the opportunity for the tribes to leverage those relationships that we have on the local level and start insisting on some of these changes being made.
Yeah. Dr. Foley, also in 2015, Adidas committed to providing design help and financial assistance to U.S. high schools that wanted to get rid of a Native American mascot or logo. How important is the influence of companies like Adidas and others in the decision process of schools contemplating mascot changes?
I think it's important, just as Delegate Teehee said earlier, the idea of corporate activism is important. I'm thinking about Bunky Echohawk and his N7 work with Nike, and how they're trying to make some changes within the sports apparel world to provide some authentic native imagery and trying to forward that. So I just think it's important, you know, if a person or a company is socially minded and cares about the, I don't know if it's millions, but hundreds of thousands of young people who are wearing their apparel, it seems like they would want to get involved in that. We've seen some of that at the college level, where in November, Native American Heritage Month, we'll see various colleges wear Native themed uniforms. And so to me, that's a positive way to acknowledge Native American history, as opposed to having a team name of some type that represents nothing accurately. And I thought it was interesting, we were talking earlier about the various boarding schools that have Native imagery, who have a Native identity. So here in Oklahoma, as mentioned, Sequoia, and then down Riverside and Darko. But how about at Pine Ridge, where they're the Thorpes? I mean, to me, that's the greatest one ever, because Jim Thorpe, you know, is this incredible athlete, probably well, people argue about him or Michael Jordan of the 20th century, you know, like who's the greatest. But he was the first president of the NFL. You know, you have this Native American history of football. If you go to the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, he is the centerpiece. There's a big statue. I mean, the whole thing is built around him. And all the early press shows that he was instrumental in getting the league going. And he was the first president because he was so well known. They made him the president of the NFL, or what became the NFL at that point. And so I think if sporting type companies, whether it's you know, Nike or Adidas or whoever, took this history into account and started to work with it, and then maybe that would educate the public as a whole and see this strong connection between athletic history and Native American history, maybe we could get some things more accurately depicted. So that's kind of really how I would answer that one, I guess.
Okay. Now that significant change is occurring within the world of sports, what's next for the mission to end cultural misappropriation of Native people in mainstream media and society? Dr. Foley, I'll let you go first.
I'm just going to say awareness and sensitivity, and as Delegate Teehee said earlier, social media. You can pop off an email to any newspaper editor, assignment editor of a news desk. Things travel so quickly now. And let's remember what the news business is, having worked in it. News is built on conflict. You know, dog bites man, no story. Man bites dog, now you got a story, right? No news is bad news. Good news is bad news. Only bad news is good news. So if you see something and whip out your cell phone camera and get it, it's going to travel around and ultimately get back to that place where it started. So I think we're all more or less citizen activists now. That's not to say that we should not use our heads and be good critical thinkers and step back and say, okay, am I really doing something that's going to help here? Or is it really confusing the situation, you know, that much more? So, you know, I want to turn it over to Delegate Teehee and see what she has to say about this one.
I would just piggyback off of what Dr. Foley was just saying. Using social media to further the education goals of what we're trying to achieve. I think also, when I mentioned earlier, tribes being in a different position economically than they were, you know, a decade ago, you know, leveraging that relationship and participating on a local level in a very meaningful way with the local school districts is I think a critical piece of this. Chief Hoskin, you know, believes firmly in this, and so as a result, we have relationships with our local school districts, our school superintendents, and such, and in dialogue with them. And you know, my view is if we're going to take our resources, then they have to be meaningful as well, and that should get us a seat at the table. We should be able to have a dialogue at it. It should lead to more education opportunities. It should lead to the more hiring of Native teachers and such in the school system, so students can see a reflection of themselves in the faculty of the schools that they attend. Maybe even in the curriculum for those that are lacking in those areas, so that the education piece can continue. I mean, every conversation that I have, especially when we started the education piece on the delegate, doesn't even begin with, you know, we got to see the delegate. It begins with nearly 200-year-old treaty and why that still matters today. And so it's basic education before you can even get to the legal piece and procedural piece of how do you actually seat somebody. And so that has to go on a micro level scale throughout the school systems that educate our kids.
Delegate Teehee, how does Cherokee Nation track and respond to some of these cultural misappropriations of Native people in media and other areas, including sports?
We actually have started working with the National Congress of American Indians. They have a toolkit. They've been working on this issue for years now, and they have a pretty good toolkit of when they become aware of a system, or you know, we ask them to, they work with us to get information immediately to the school district. We track the schools that continue to have these mascot names and imagery, and I actually have staff working now to delve into a little bit more, like a little bio on that school's mascot history, including the pictures and such that they have depicted on it. And so we do those to not only be informed and be made aware, but we do it also in a way to be more proactive in how we request that these schools, you know, change their name and what that process might look like. And so that's kind of what we're doing, but we view it all at the end of the day as, you know, if we find something that's wrong, we hear of something that's wrong, you know, we try to say something and do something about it. And so, and we do it in a way that offers education as the response in order to achieve the ultimate goal, which is eliminating the use of Native imagery in the first place.
Dr. Foley, is there anything more you'd like to offer before we end this virtual roundtable?
I would say a couple things. Before ending, I would just say it's a total honor to be here with you both. And I'm just so proud of Delegate Teehee and the work that she's doing and how this represents this whole arc of history of recognition of Native American well, sovereignty is the word that gets thrown around now, but somehow that word has gotten bad all of a sudden. I don't know why that's happened, but in any case, just what she represents and all the work that she's done and the way in which this represents the positive things that are happening in Indian country. But a couple things I would say, people who are hyper aware of the word politically correct should rethink that term in their head, because what we really, that's only been around since the 80s, and it came out as a result of talk radio. What PC really means is to be informed. And now if somebody tells you they're being politically correct, they don't really believe what they're saying. They're just saying it because they know they can't say it another way. So what we really want to get to a point is where people are informed with real information about this. And one of the websites I would always direct people to is AISTM.org, or just enter in Google American Indian Sports Team Mascots, and you'll see like a constant update of stories all around the country that are happening on this. For Native people specifically, having been a K through 12 Indian Parent Committee member, because I had a Native child in the school system, meaning I could go and be part of it, that is where you start to affect change in your school system, is through that Indian Education Committee. Now, not everybody has that around the country, but here in Oklahoma, almost every school district is either a JOM school or has Indian education, and you can start to work through those committees to affect change at your school. If your school is playing a team with a mascot that's coming in, see if you can get your public address announcer just not to even say the name, just say the name of the town or the high school, and that's it. In addition to that, you can bring awareness through those committees. And from my experience, not enough people really get involved. It's always like 5 people at the meeting signing off on the grants and stuff. So I would encourage people to get involved in their Indian education operations of their local public schools. And here in Oklahoma, we have an unchallenged tort law, and Delegate Teehee knows all about this, but it's the general rights of persons are basically what tort law is from my lay understanding. And we have one in the general rights of persons that is the right to not be offended. And it goes back to when African Americans were not allowed to try on clothes in clothing stores in Oklahoma. And like if you tried it on, you had to buy it, kind of thing. So there's a tort law we have. Now, it takes somebody with standing and all these other legal machinations that go on. But I just think it's interesting that we actually have a tort law that guarantees Oklahomans the right to not be offended. Well, now you get into all the parsing out of that. So in really closing, I always say stereotypes are a negative. Native American mascots with regard to stereotypes make everybody seem the same, and they're not. Whatever number we're at now, 500 different tribal entities or so in the United States, a wide variety of differences that anybody that's really watching this probably mostly knows about. Making light of these significant cultural traditions is also a negative of these, but I would also emphasize, as we did earlier, the anti-Indian imagery that comes out of this that's often violent. And if you're talking about missing and murdered Indian women, or you're looking at the way in which children are mistreated, and if you're looking at all of these things building on what we now know as DNA trauma, these just compound it. You want to add to not just self-esteem, but depression, which leads to all kinds of other negatives. So on one hand, you can say this is just a PC issue, but if you say that, you don't really know enough. You don't know the way in which this resonates in people, and sometimes people and kids don't even know why it resonates in them in a negative way. And so that's also part of the education. So I would just encourage us all to keep on learning and keep our minds open, and to keep working and using the tools that we have to try and help people move along in this story, which I think will have a good ending, hopefully while we're all still here in a physical sense on the planet. But if not, good. You know, I think that sometime in the future, these things will change, as they are starting to slowly.
Delegate Teehee, your thoughts?
Thank you, Tyler, and thank you, Dr. Foley. I appreciate it being in this discussion with you. You hit on something that I wanted to raise, which is dealing with the historic trauma. You know, the historic mistreatment and disregard for our people that was vested in federal law and policy, and the trauma that our people are facing today, whether it's you know, how you know, crimes are investigated against our women and children, or how we deal with high teenage suicide rates and high dropout rates and low matriculation rates and such. I mean, those are the real worries. And what Dr. Foley hit on, something which is critical in my mind, which is the compounding way that these racist mascots, racial slurs, and the impact they have on our children, especially in this country, is enormous. I mean, we've seen the studies, we've seen science to back up what we know to be true, and it's and I also want to be mindful of the fact that, this larger effort of eliminating mascots has had a great deal of success. It's just we're living in a time of the most notable success, but there have been on the college level, thankfully, and because of NCAA's efforts dealing with mascots, have had a turning tide on that level. We're facing the public school systems now. I'm hoping that because of the way the NFL is handling the Washington football team, that will have some effect there as well. And we've seen the successes already. We have the successful template that's working. I think as long as we keep our corporate sponsors, keep the alliances that we have with a lot of other partners and organizations, I think we can have even more success in addressing this issue.
Okay. Dr. Foley, Delegate Teehee, thank you for joining me today and shedding light on the significance of this issue. It's greatly appreciated. I also want to thank our audience for watching the Cherokee Phoenix Breakdown, and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for our next episode. Thank you. What up?
Go.